Hello and welcome to our short presentation about our research. And I'm Dr. Ursula Edgington, based in New Zealand.
And I'm Luke Swiatek, based at the University of New South Wales, or UNSW, in Sydney.
Thank you. And so this is a qualitative inquiry into interpretations of culturally sensitive pedagogy from the narratives of award-winning tertiary teachers in Aotearoa, New Zealand and Australia. And this particular research presentation is looking at the outcomes from the New Zealand participants. So first of all, we'd like to do an acknowledgement to the Indigenous peoples, respect to the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, the Tiriti of Waitangi, and tēnā koutou katoa, he mihi nui ki a koutou, nā kai rangahau, nā kai ako, nā akonga hoki, tēnā rā koutou katoa. So a quick welcome to all teachers, students and researchers to our presentation, and we encourage you to comment and feedback to us at the end, where we'll provide a Google form for you to engage with us.
And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia. And in particular, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the unceded lands on which the UNSW Sydney campus stands, the Bedegal people, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Always was Aboriginal land, always will be.
A quick funding acknowledgement to HERDSA, who provided the Small Research Grant Award for us to carry out this small project, and also to UNSW, who offered match support, which Luke would like to say a few words about.
Yes, I'd like to thank the Faculty of Arts, Design and Architecture for the ECR support scheme, the funding that it provided through that in 2021.
Thank you. And also a quick word to the New Zealand Ethics Committee, which is a non-profit organisation which helps independent scholars like myself who aren't attached to any formal institution, and provides very valuable feedback regarding ethics applications for research projects such as this. A summary of the presentation will look at the background to the project, the aims of the research. We'll briefly touch on the methodology and the theoretical lens that we used. We'll also talk about the challenges that we encountered, including the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact that had. We'll talk about the findings that we have discovered so far, because this is a project still in ongoing, and also the discussion and the conclusions and some short recommendations based on our findings. And again, we welcome any feedback and comments you may have. At the end, there'll be a link to a Google form for you to do this. So the research question that we had underlying this research was, how do award-winning tertiary teachers in Australasia interpret, create and reflect on their own culturally sensitive pedagogical strategies? This is what guided our research. And the aims of the research really were based on the increasing competitive global marketplace, and in particular in the context of the COVID-19 global pandemic. There's tensions and challenges in responding to the needs of multicultural classrooms, face-to-face and online, and increasingly that's a priority. Institutions and educators now need to be responsive to the needs of those diverse students and their different ways of learning. And the significance of the project, really, our motivations are based on helping to raise awareness of and also fostering improved culturally sensitive pedagogy in the tertiary sectors. The methodology and theoretical lenses that we used was based on looking at the data that was only available in publicly available information, specifically based on the award-winning tertiary teachers that we identified in New Zealand and Australia. We invited the participants via Zoom to be interviewed. Obviously, this was because of the COVID-19 restrictions. The qualitative interviews took place, lasted normally about an hour or more, and the transcripts were anonymised and amended by the various participants. The qualitative analysis that we used was an iterative thematic narrative analysis, where we drew out various themes from the narratives. And because it was an interpretive work, we used the relevant symbolic interactionism, and also out of the narratives, we used the critical race theory, because that became increasingly relevant, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement in people's minds. The challenges of the research, Luke's going to talk a bit about that.
Thank you. Yes, COVID-19 had profound impacts on all of us, individually, but also on our loved ones and our colleagues around the world. And unfortunately, it impacted our research project as well. We found that we had increased workloads to deal with, as well as institutional turbulences of different kinds. And unfortunately, we ended up having to let go of one of our colleagues who was forced to step down from the project simply because of his increased workload and caring responsibilities. We also found that the pandemic created communication difficulties with our research participants, with our interviewees particularly, and we anticipate that those are probably likely to continue in the Australian phase of the data gathering as well.
So the findings of the research then, perhaps the most surprising initial finding that we got was that we literally couldn't find some of the award-winning teachers in New Zealand, because some of the universities simply didn't publish who those teachers were. So that was unexpected. And the reasons for this lack of transparency were not very clear, even upon a little bit of investigation. And we're suspicious that this links to some aspects of our previous research we've done in this area regarding tall poppy syndrome, but that's obviously outside the the criteria of this small research project, but certainly something that's worth investigating in the future. So as Luke mentioned, the Australian fieldwork's currently ongoing, so we'll anticipate reporting on that later at a later date. But the initial outcomes from the data analysis do suggest that cultural competence is interpreted by these award-winning teachers in New Zealand really by descriptions of their environment that they're trying to create for their students, the atmosphere in physical and virtual classrooms was described with words repeatedly being used, such as humility, safe, secure, welcoming, hospitality, etc. So these link to the Maori concepts of manakitanga and whanaungatanga and ako, which all illustrate those sorts of relationships, the social aspects of learning, and also that obviously links to well-established educational theoretical frameworks around that importance of social learning. All the participants were very keen to reflect and share with us the culturally sensitive aspects of their pedagogy. Some of them had some funny little anecdotes to share with us, and some sad ones as well, about how their students had done well and reached their potential, for instance, and also the tensions involved in the paperwork and bureaucracy around creating their teaching award portfolios, and how difficult that was, and perhaps it wasn't seen as being particularly culturally competent itself, which is a bit of a paradox. So some themes of the narratives there are explained briefly. There was, as I say, the themes around humility and hospitality, but also there was issues around mindfulness and cultural competence, and the Treaty of Waitangi often came up, both as a positive and a negative challenge, and the appreciation of otherness and difference, and how that brings value to the classroom. And there's some quotes here. There's two slides here of some anecdotes of quotes from the narratives. So I'd encourage you to pause the recording now and maybe read through a couple of these. And there's also some additional extracts from the narratives that we will post on the Google Forms link that's at the end of this presentation. But overall, there was a focus on the interactive, non-judgmental learning environment that these teachers were encouraging, also encouraging their students to have critical thinking skills and to reinterpret and take responsibility for their own learning outcomes. And as I just mentioned, the critical race theory was certainly a common thing for the teachers to mention, because that was, it's been ongoing in the news recently. So the Black Lives Matter movements were widely acknowledged by a lot of the participants to have impacted on their students' critical awareness of cultural competence issues. There was also some compromises that the teachers had said that they'd made. Some of them noted that their institutional norms, systems and policies were sometimes unhelpful in helping them to be culturally competent in their teaching practice. And the narratives do describe how these teachers overcame some of these barriers in order to help their students to reach their potential. So some discussion points, going back to the first finding that I mentioned. It's an important question. Why are some New Zealand universities not proactively publishing the details of their award-winning teachers? We're very unclear about that, and that could definitely be helpful in sharing good practice and best practice amongst tertiary teachers in New Zealand. And what about personally, how does your interpretation of cultural competence in teaching and learning compare to the examples that we've shown you here? What examples of culturally competent teaching and learning would you like to share? And what about the impact of COVID-19? How has it impacted you and your teaching and learning? And how do you think that might impact on future teaching awards for university staff, especially with reduced budgets, etc.? And how can culturally competent pedagogies be promoted more broadly in university teaching practice? We'd encourage you to add your comments and feedback on our Google form, as I say, which is the link at the end. And in conclusion, universities could be publicly acknowledging the success of all their awardees in teaching quality recognition. The collection of evidence of teaching awards could be more humanistic and culturally sensitive. For instance, one of the participants noted that there could be ways of using innovative technologies, and certainly the creative arts could be a useful way of people expressing their personal teaching philosophies using spoken word or other kinds of maybe music in a more innovative, creative way, rather than that rigid criteria of a text-based document with a strict word criteria. Raising awareness of legal responsibilities for universities, not only to overcome discrimination in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, but also to be more proactive and being culturally sensitive, especially as the Black Lives Matter movement continues to evolve. And finally, the reading about cultural competence should really be expressed in classroom behaviours. This, it's all very well learning the theory, but how, as researchers, are we going to be measuring the impact of culturally competent pedagogies, and how are we going to go about sharing best practice? And Luke, I think it's over to you.
Thank you. Yes, just to conclude, we'd like to, what we mentioned before, mention again that we have a Google form through which you can interact with us. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear your suggestions, questions and comments about the research. So if you'd like to engage, please feel very welcome to head to the tiny URL link, which you can see there on the slide. We're aware of the fact that the Google Forms don't work on all browsers. So if you get a message saying that the page has been blocked, just try to access it with another browser. But we look forward to hearing from you, and we hope to engage around these and other aspects of the research to date.
Thank you very much for listening. We look forward to hearing from you.